The war between Ukraine and Russia has become a phenomenon where drones carry the hopes of freedom to the skies. UAVs, which are in the inventory of the Ukrainian armed forces, are constantly flying over the Ukrainian skies for the surrender practice of the Kiev administration called I Want to Live. A large part of the soldiers in the Russian army, on the other hand, are unaware of their commanders, or they are waiting for hope from the UAVs they send together with the front commanders for the delivery of the Ukrainian forces. This is perhaps the clearest summary of what Russian leader Vladimir Putin has done to his army. The moments of surrender of the Russian troops to the Ukrainian UAVs have started to be experienced intensively, especially in the eastern Donetsk front lines recently. The latest examples of this situation were seen in the city of Bakhmut, the most active front line of the Donetsk region. Let's witness together the most dramatic moments that the Russians have experienced since the beginning of the war, perhaps until now. In recent days, images from the Bakhmut front line, which cannot match the movies, have come the moment of a flesh and blood soldier surrendering to a plastic and metal robot was captured on camera. The striking footage came as Kiev forces made significant advances in the Bakhmut region this week. According to Ukrainian Ground Forces Commander General Alexander Kursky, Yuri Fedorenko, the commander of the drone in Ukraine's 92nd Mechanized Brigade, shared a video of the peace offer on Telegram. The poignant aerial footage released by the Ukrainian military unconfirmed shows the moment when one of Putin's troops was given the option to surrender. The drone combat aircraft team detected a Russian soldier who asked him not to bomb himself. The aircraft crew left him a note with instructions to surrender and follow a drone. The Russian soldier accepted the note left by the drone, even though his friends fired from behind him. Thus began the adventure of the surrender of the Russian soldier. The soldier went out from his trench to open ground and began to follow the drone. The soldier, advancing with the directions from the unmanned aerial vehicle, walked among his friends who lost their lives on the front lines. The march of the Russian soldier was accompanied by Ukrainian infantrymen and scouts. After the march, the soldier reached the Ukrainian positions. Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Mikhail Fedorov said that the soldier is currently in custody. The most striking detail here is that the Russian soldier surrendered to a drone. Ukraine is calling on Russian soldiers to do just that. According to the reports of the Ukrainian authorities, 3,200 Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces in March. More than 4,500 Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces in April. According to Vitaly Matviyenko, the number of Russian applications increased by 10% from March to April. In May, this rate increased even more. The main reason for the increase in the number of Russian applicants who wanted to surrender was that Ukraine's counterattack could start at any time. The Russians, who do not ignore this possibility, resort to the compassionate project of Ukraine to save their lives. The offensive of the Ukrainian army, which was expected in May, finally started this week with a big breakthrough. In the past 15 days, the Russian soldiers and army felt much more pressure and experienced a heavy psychological depression. The Ukrainian offensive finally took place with a sudden raid led by the Azov Regiment in Bakhmut. While the Great Offensive, led by the Azov Regiment, continues at full speed, the Russians surrender to the Ukrainian army every second or leave their weapons and flee. It is estimated that nearly 1,000 Russian soldiers surrendered to the Azov Regiment, especially in the last 5 days. Surrender rates in May are at an all-time high, averaging at 200 per day. Vitaly Matviyenko, head of the Ukraine hotline, announced that more than 19,000 Russian applicants have surrendered to the Ukrainian armed forces through the projects in September began. When we consider all this data, we can clearly understand that there is a serious decline in the Russian army. Breakthroughs in the Russian army are increasing day by day. A blow to the Russian army, which is shaken by the surrendered soldiers, comes from the Kiev forces on the front lines. The Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade is believed to have led the offensive that resulted in Russian troops fleeing Bakhmut. The Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade is the new formation of the Azov Regiment, the tanks of the Ukrainian Azov Regiment, with its new name. The 3rd Taras Brigade also provides support as a result of the joint operations of the tanks and the brigade. The Russian forces are forced to withdraw at the same time. Footage from the front line seems to confirm Ukraine's reports of a successful counterattack around Bakhmut. According to conflict analyst Igor Sushko, the Ukrainian army has recaptured about 7.8 kilometers squared of the city in recent clashes. According to the Ukrainian soldiers on the ground, the 6th and 8th divisions of the Russian army and the 72nd Brigade were defeated. So in which regions and how do the Russians surrender? What measures is Ukraine taking for the surrender of the Russians guaranteeing their lives? The head of the Ukraine hotline, Vitaly Matvienko, noted that the calls came mainly from the Moscow and Leningrad regions, as well as Chelyabinsk, Novgorod and occupied Donetsk, Luhansk and Crimea. Last month, the Ukrainian military released an instructional video explaining how to surrender to a wave to the Russians. The Ukrainian army has released an instructional video for Russian soldiers with a step-by-step guide on how to surrender to one of the drones. The video comes as part of Ukraine's I Want to Live project, a hotline that encourages Russians who do not want to fight in Ukraine to surrender. Soldiers who surrender are instructed to call the I Want to Live hotline to prearrange the time and place of the meeting. After the location of the soldiers are verified, the soldiers must go to the specified place at the exact time specified. Once the soldiers are in place, they should wait for the drone to appear. If the drone has not appeared, soldiers should wait for further instructions. When the soldiers see the UAV in the field of view, they have to make eye contact with it. Soldiers must then raise their arms and signal that they are ready to follow. After that, the drone will move up and down a few meters before moving at walking speed towards the closest representatives of the Ukrainian army. Finally, the drone will liberate the Russian soldiers who want to surrender. Ukraine wants to prove that salvation is so easy and close with the video it has published. In addition, the I Want to Live project initiated by Ukraine reconnected tens of thousands of Russian soldiers to life. Ukrainian authorities reported that a website called I Want to Live created for the Russian soldiers who wanted to surrender had attracted nearly 20 million visitors in the last 8 months. The I Want to Live hotline receives an average of 80 calls a day from people in Russia or the occupied territory of Ukraine who don't want to die for Putin's dreams and are willing to surrender. In addition, Ukraine developed a new strategies to persuade Russian soldiers to surrender and displayed remarkable creativity. Konstantin Melnikov, a war correspondent who is often on the front lines, said that the Ukrainian army designs its own advertising campaigns. Melnikov said Ukrainian troops printed special leaflets, loaded them into shells and fired them in Russian-occupied territory with a Grad rocket launcher. The brochures also contain phone numbers that Russians can call if they want to turn themselves in. A price list showing how much money you can make if you surrender with equipment is also included in the brochures. Soldiers who deliver a tank can receive a $10,000 payment. Analysts say that unlike Russia, the rights of prisoners of war in Ukraine are respected. Ukraine's respect for the rights of prisoners of war is another detail that attracts Russian soldiers. This humanitarian stance of Ukraine paves the way for the surrender of more Russian soldiers. As a result, given the increasing rate of giving up from Vladimir Putin's war and surrendering to the Ukrainians, it's not surprising that drones will capture many more prisoners of war in the weeks and months to come. The real question here is how Vladimir Putin will deal with these surrenders. We will wait and see what the Russian leader's reaction to this humiliating situation will be. The Russia-Ukraine war has intensified in the occupied territories. Russia had to abandon many occupied territories. The Russian army is unable to succeed on the front with untrained soldiers and insufficient ammunition. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is unable to prevent his failure against Ukraine. Developments on the streets of Russia these days show that Putin is now accepting defeat. Russia has shifted from an offensive to a defensive posture on many fronts in the occupied territories, but the recent development shows much more. Russia has started deploying air defense systems on the streets of the capital, Moscow. Thousands of Twitter users from many countries shared images of the deployment of air defense systems on unused buildings on the streets of Moscow. In the images shared as photos and videos, it is seen that Panzers I air defense systems are deployed on the roofs of abandoned buildings on the streets of Moscow and on the roof of the Russian Defense Ministry's National Defense Management Center building. Putin's move amounts to an acknowledgement of his regression with a recipe because Putin, who has failed in the regions where the war is intense, thinks that the war can spread to his country at any moment. For this reason, he is deploying Russian-made Panzers I anti-aircraft artillery systems in various parts of the city against a possible Ukrainian air attack. It is rumored that Putin took this precautionary measure after Western European countries announced a military aid package, including long-range weapons, to be sent to the Ukrainian Army, allegedly along with the anti-aircraft systems placed on rooftops. Moscow surroundings have also been equipped with massive air defense systems. It is said that S-400 air defense systems have been placed in various parts of the capital since the beginning of the war. The Ukrainian army has shown great success in the occupied territories. Putin, on the other hand, has tried to cover up his failure by attacking civilian areas and infrastructure. The Ukrainian army is very careful not to attack civilians. Ukrainian President Zelensky has often said that the difference between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army is in targeting civilians. Since the beginning of the war, the Ukrainian army has successfully struck several military air bases and military airfields in Russia. These include Engels Military Airfield in the Saratov region and the Akolovo Military Airfield in the city of Ryazan. The Ukrainian Air Force had already reached Russian territory bypassing the occupation zones. Ukrainian kamikaze aid drones bombed an oil facility in Novocherkassk, Rostov region, the largest oil refinery in southern Russia. Likewise, 2 Ukrainian helicopters crossed the Russian border, flew 40 kilometers on notice, and hit warehouses belonging to a Russian oil company. The missile attack on the Russian city of Belgorod also shows that the Ukrainian army has crossed the Russian border many times. So why is Putin making such a move now by deploying anti-aircraft, missile and artillery systems on the streets of Russia? Putin has admitted that he has reached the final point because the Russian army is losing every day against Ukraine. Russia has lost over 120,000 soldiers less than a year into the war. Even the mandatory mobilization orders announced can't solve this problem. Russian youths do not want to fight, and the Russian people are increasing their street protests against the occupation every day. Putin has also lost hundreds of thousands of ammunition during the war. The successful operations of the Ukrainian army's air and ground forces, which destroyed Russian military bases and ammunition depots, show that Russia is in a state of irrecoverable decline. Russian leader Putin has failed to solve all these problems. His failure is now evident in the withdrawal of troops from the front, unarmed and without ammunition. Putin fears that the war will spread to the streets of Russia in the face of the Russian army's retreat and the Ukrainian army's excellent advice. That's why the city is being equipped with anti-aircraft air systems. Russia has no presence in the regions where the war is raging. The war is currently raging in the eastern regions of Ukraine, in the cities of Donetsk and Luhansk. In the cities of Bakhmut and Soledar in this region, the Ukrainian troops are riding an epic against the Russian invaders. The Russian army, on the other hand, has many problems within itself. In the past days, soldiers of the Russian private military company Wagner Group operating in the occupied territories announced that they had captured the city of Soledar, but soon after, a statement came from the Kremlin. The separate statements of the Russian army and Wagner Group soldiers caused controversy. There are many different units in the Russian army. Among these units, the Wagner Group and Kadyrov soldiers have been on the agenda since the beginning of the war. The mercenaries belonging to the Wagner Group company are unaware that they are fighting for company owner Yevgeny Prigozhin's school of seizing the salt mines and underground resources in the city of Salatov. Chechen soldiers loyal to Chechnya's unpopular President Kadyrov are on the front line because Putin holds Kadyrov's office. Meanwhile, soldiers of the Russian armed forces, on the other hand, are forced to fulfill their military service, unaware that they are fighting for Putin's political ambition and reputation. In short, not all Russian troops are volunteers and violent soldiers. This is causing Russia to lose more and more day by day. It is also stated that these units of the Russian army cannot agree among themselves. The soldiers belonging to the Wagner Group do not listen to the commanders of the Russian army. Chechen troops loyal to Kadyrov are humiliated because of their race. This turmoil within the army is preparing the end of Russia. The recent dismissal of Sergei Surovikin, the commander in charge of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, proves that Russia is exhausted. The Ukrainian army is making history with its successes against Russia. Zelensky is united with his army and his people. As the war intensifies, the resistance of the Ukrainian people is getting stronger. In contrast to the problems in the Russian army, the Ukrainian army is united with all its units against the invaders. Soldiers of the Azov Battalion, of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, and the Kraken Regiment of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine have carried out spectacular operations in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions where the war is raging. These units are made up of the most experienced soldiers serving in the Ukrainian army. After the loss of Crimea in 2014, the Ukrainian army has paid great attention to their work. The Azov Battalion and the Kraken Regiment were formed after the loss of Crimea at the beginning of the Russian occupation. The Ukrainian army placed its most experienced soldiers and commanders in these battalions. Both battalions played a major role in the Ukrainian army is adverse against the invaders. In the new year, the war intensified in the shadow of reshuffles, explosions, gains and losses. The Ukrainian army, with the support of Western and European countries, continues to strengthen its army day by day. The Russian army, on the other hand, is on the decline due to sanctions, troop and ammunition shortages and other unfavorable developments. Russia has lost almost 70% of the territory it occupied in Ukraine. Zelensky is also trying to take Crimea, annexed by Russian occupiers in 2014 from the Russians in the new year. The Russian-Ukrainian war is expected to become more heated. We will continue to bring you all new developments in the war zones. Why do you think Russia has placed anti-aircraft systems on the streets of Moscow? Will Putin be able to solve the problems of troops, ammunition and units in the Russian army? How do you interpret the successes of the Ukrainian army? There are a lot of developments in the east. Here, Russian forces concentrated their efforts on expanding the buffer zone to the north of Bakhmut to protect their flanks in the face of the imminent Ukrainian counteroffensive. They started pushing along the highway and even got notable results. But because they got too far from their defense and were operating on a very narrow front, Russian losses have doubled and continue to stay at more than 1,000 killed per day. Last time I told you that one of the main axes of Ukrainian counterattack was recently revealed by Russians because the concentration of Ukrainian forces in Mankivka and neighboring settlements has substantially increased. I also told you that in response to this development, Wagner's focus more than a third of their forces on this 5-kilometer front line in order to create a buffer zone as fast as possible. The freshest reports provided by the Ukrainian spokesman of the Eastern Group of Forces noted that the intensity of fights around Bakhmut increased even more after establishing control over Dubovo-Vasilivka. Russian forces struggled to move directly to Orahovo-Vasilyevka because of a natural barrier in the form of another hill. Russian forces shifted their fire on the Ukrainian strongpoint near the highway, and after they breached it, they could approach Ukrainian positions on this hill along the tree lines. Such a development exposed Ukrainian positions in Orika Vasilivka, and according to Russian sources, Ukrainians had to retreat from 2 checkpoints inside the village out of 4 due to the overwhelming crossfire. The main goal of the Russians is to get to Minivg, exactly where Ukrainians have their forces concentrations. The idea here is to start attacking them before they launch a counterattack. This way, Ukrainians will get entangled in positional fights, which will complicate offensive actions significantly. The second thing Wagners are doing is trying to breach the most fortified area inside Bakhmut, the ASM industrial area. Some sources reported that Wagners have already entered the northern part of the industrial area. However, reports with recently made geolocated footage only confirmed that Russians maintain positions no closer than 800 meters from this complex. The main idea of attacking the most formidable defenses is that if Wagner somehow managed to breach it, then Bakhmut will fall very rapidly, and there would be no point in making this massive counterattack. But such a risky and aggressive approach comes at a great cost. Since Wagner forces launched this highly attritional westward expansion, Russian losses have spiked once again. And if last week Russians were losing approximately 600 soldiers, then over the last 3 days, Russians are losing almost twice as many soldiers. Russian sources reported that Wagner's advances are constrained by artillery and mortar strikes as well as air strikes because Wagners are advancing along the very narrow line to the north of Bakhmut. Ukrainians are engaging their artillery units not only from Konstantinovka, but also Seversk. Ukrainian mortar units are shelling Russians from safe positions behind the canal in Novomarkovo. Advancement along such a narrow line also means that Russians are getting too far from their air defense, which makes them vulnerable to air strikes. Yesterday, it was confirmed that Ukrainians are freely engaging up to 6 fighter jets to bomb Russian strongpoints. Today it was also reported that 3 helicopter gunships are operating at low altitudes for the long-running battle for Bakhmut. With that in mind, the spike in Russian losses is not surprising. In order to compensate for such levels of losses, the head of Wagner Group, Prigozhin, doubled down on expanding recruitment efforts in Russia. At first, they were opening recruitment centers at sport clubs. But lately, Wagner Group has also started focusing on youth. Wagner Group has recently opened 6 recruitment centers in schools. Russian Ministry of Education in a parody included Wagner personnel at a career guidance lesson to tell heroic stories and promote the service in the Wagner Group. The Wagner Group likely aims to recruit more impressionable recruits through this youth-focused campaigns and instill in them Prigozhin's extreme ideology. Some Russian officials are even advertising contract service in unusual places. For example, it was recently revealed that a Moscow-based psychiatrist is calling on suicidal men to join army and die for a good cause. Overall, Wagner forces are trained to cancel the Ukrainian counteroffensive at any cost. Prigozhin understands that right now, the success of his 7-month-long campaign is at stake, and no matter the losses, he must somehow prevent it. Many analysts are saying that Ukrainians will likely launch their counteroffensive on Monday or Tuesday. However, Ukrainians are still controlling their positions on the biggest hill in the area, which does not allow Wagners to even clear the village. So Ukrainians should still have a little time to wait for the ground to dry up in order to increase the chances of their success.